For a long time now, I've been wondering why video games have fallen into the Hollywood trap of making everything bigger and bigger in an effort to appeal to everyone simultaneously. The necessity for returns begins to progressively choke out most creativity until everything is indistinguishable from everything else. Making games designed to appeal to everyone while being infinitely replayable is perhaps a good strategy for maximizing return on investment in the short term, but when playing poker, it would be a mistake to go all in on every hand. Even if the potential returns are maximized, so are the losses. An unsustainable philosophy for both corporations and the people working for them. Sifu is an example of what could be achieved with a smaller project led by very talented people. A return to a more fun and interesting style of game design where risk and individuality is possible. A reminder of the kind of games that could be made with a strategically limited scope, a focus on executing a small number of ideas as well as possible, rather than trying to be everything all at once. In a time where many games are following trends for the sake of it and falling into the trap of feature bloat, Sifu is content to give you only what is absolutely necessary to be the game that it wants to be, and to convey its message without interference. Sifu feels like a very old-school experience, harkening back to the days of the PlayStation 2 and the early 2000s era of game design. A descendant of linear beat-em-up games that focused on higher difficulty, genuine replayability, and player mastery. A philosophy of game design that had one foot in the world of progressively more story-driven and casually difficult home console games, and another in the fast-paced, difficulty-by-necessity design of older arcade games. A balance of two at first seemingly very distant philosophies brought together via excellent execution on engaging mechanics and just enough plot to hook the imagination, as well as a strong, moral message conveyed with the requisite tact and subtlety to truly make people listen. I think a moment to talk about the games that I see in Sifu and the lineage that I believe it follows would be prudent. Building out a family tree in my head tends to work better than untangling the word salad genre list that games have trended towards. While looking into the game online, I have seen many people compare Sifu to Sekiro, and the comparison is a fairly apt one. Both games have demanding combat that requires the player to memorize enemy attack patterns, timings, and to abuse openings to punish those enemies. To strengthen the comparison, Sifu features a structure mechanic similar to Sekiro's posture. When someone's structure is broken, they are vulnerable to a finishing move that neutralizes them. And of course, both games' emphasis on multi-phase boss fights. Although Sifu certainly takes a less is more approach in this regard. Mechanically, these are fairly strong similarities, and I do think the developers probably chose to display structure the way they did in order to visually communicate these similarities at a glance. However, strict mechanical comparisons aside, I don't find much similarity between the two games, personally. Nothing in Sifu, despite being a difficult game, was anywhere near as demanding as Sekiro, nor does Sifu feel anything like Sekiro. Their tone and overall vibe aren't even in the same ballpark. Personally, the game that Sifu reminds me of the most is the Mark of Kree. Although mechanically they're only somewhat similar, they feel like cousins in game design. They both feature a martially proficient protagonist, a small number of well-made and memorable levels, a peaceful home used as level punctuation, a distinctive art style, striking presentation, a minimally told story, arenas with additional bespoke challenges, unlockable costumes, and the presence of a magical object of central importance to the plot. And while the Mark of Kree is not necessarily an industry-defining game, it was, for me personally, the first game I remember where I encountered the you versus many combat popularized by the Assassin's Creed and later Arkham franchises. In many ways, the Mark of Kree was the prototype to this later developed style of combat. And while Devil May Cry was certainly the seminal game of this type, which took the genre in a different direction, the progenitor of games like Ninja Gaiden and Bayonetta, the Mark of Kree came out less than a year later, showing that they were being developed concurrently. Although the Mark of Kree lacked the puzzle platforming present in Devil May Cry, it made up for it with stealth mechanics and some light environmental interactions. It was possible to complete some levels without ever engaging in full-on combat if you're careful. The Mark of Kree is a pleasant blending of genres into something unique and memorable. Sifu also reminded me of Jet Li Rise to Honor, another Sony game for the PlayStation 2, featuring a similar inspiration of martial arts action movies. The comparison between Sifu and Rise to Honor are much more immediately apparent, although perhaps less flattering than the Mark of Kree. Rise to Honor was a somewhat John Woo-inspired martial arts game that follows an undercover cop infiltrating organized crime in Hong Kong with third-person shooter sections and a combat system even more closely related to Arkham. The thing that set it apart from everything else was that instead of using face buttons to attack, you used the right analog stick. An intuitive, if slightly awkward control scheme used most notably by the first Monster Hunter, which came out in Japan less than a month later. Rise to Honor is, in my opinion, a very obvious spiritual ancestor to the significantly better Sleeping Dogs, which is of notable mention in that it did everything Rise to Honor did, and more, but better. Not to discredit its predecessor, just to say that Rise to Honor helped pave the way for better games to come later. The foundation it built being used to better effect by the games that came after, and ultimately being eclipsed by its successors. Whether deliberately or not, Sifu has used the lessons learned by the experimentation present in many of these older games to craft an experience that feels both new and old, a mechanical design philosophy that wouldn't feel out of place in a 20-year-old game, while still having much of the convenience, quality, and presentation you would expect from a more well-produced and accessible modern game. This is an aspect that makes Sifu stand out from other games in my opinion. When looking at it through a more modern style of game design, it appears to be something that, in my opinion, it isn't. I have seen many people call Sifu a run-based roguelite. I disagree with this interpretation. I think of Sifu as an arcade-like instead. I look at it like this. Sifu has a small number of difficult and static levels punctuated with very challenging boss fights, a lightly presented story, beginning of the level checkpoints, a generous but limited number of lives before game over, and an emphasis on playing as well as possible to generate high scores. If you ask me, the only thing that it lacks is a scoreboard, and it could almost be an arcade game. And when viewing Sifu through the lens of older arcade games, the linearity and size of the game makes a lot of sense, as does the form of progression and presentation. Like arcade games of the past, Sifu does a very good job of both incentivizing and demanding good play from the player. If you were to play Sifu ideally, you would never die and could squeeze the maximum number of points out of every enemy. Doing so would require staying the youngest possible, giving you the most available health and the least available damage, allowing for more room for error and the most point potential from enemies. However, even with the maximum amount of health, you can die to a few well-placed attacks, and you can be easily overwhelmed by a group. If you're having trouble, you will very quickly realize that the basic moveset you start with is inadequate for dealing with the number of foes the game throws at you. And on death, you are presented with a plethora of new options to deal with the problems you just encountered. You'll realize there are a variety of attacks present meant to control the crowd and disable specific enemies, as well as counters to certain attacks. Additionally, as the character ages, you are locked out of certain skills and shrine bonuses if you haven't unlocked them already. Thankfully, this penalty is offset by a noticeable increase in damage the older you get. However, in order to keep the game challenging, your maximum health is lowered alongside this damage boost, creating a glass cannon style of play the older that you get, eventually leaving you with no more lives, the lowest possible health, and the most possible damage, making the game the easiest and hardest it can be simultaneously, further incentivizing the player to play well and die less the older that they get, with the maximum age demanding the best play from the player while also facilitating the easiest fights. This necessity to play well is also emphasized by Sifu's score mechanic. You are encouraged to consistently change up your offense using a variety of different attacks to maintain a higher score multiplier, and to avoid being hit for as long as possible to prevent losing said multiplier. All these different elements feed into each other. The less you are hit, the less likely you are to die. The less you die, the more health you have and skills you can unlock. The more attacks you have, the more tools are available to facilitate a higher score multiplier. It's a very elegant system that flows in and out of itself like the knot on top of the pendant central to the game's plot. The better you understand your moveset and how to exploit enemy weaknesses, the more you can push your score by keeping enemies alive longer, which opens you up for more danger over time, naturally increasing the challenge and demanding better play. Very few games are this tightly designed. Every mechanic helps facilitate every other mechanic, and while I wouldn't say that Sifu is super deep, it absolutely is not shallow. The game has a pleasant level of complexity, enough to be enjoyable and allow for technical play without being arcane, and while it certainly took me a decent amount of time to understand some of the finer aspects of the combat system, I never felt excluded by a lack of player knowledge. Sifu is difficult to master, but it's very easy to pick up and play, and not having a full understanding of everything never overtly impacted my enjoyment. However, I can see how it could for some players, as Sifu's base tutorialization does leave a lot to be desired. Fortunately, there is an optional, more in-depth tutorial in the interstitial Wuguan area. This more in-depth tutorial is not as exhaustive as I might have liked, but it clarified most of my misunderstandings I had with the game's systems. The optional tutorial also offers a practice mode for those inclined to use it, which can be extremely helpful for practicing against the more troublesome enemies. Even then, there are still some mechanics I don't fully understand. However, despite that, I have been able to beat the game and achieve the secret ending despite a lack of perfect understanding. Like some of its more obfuscated mechanics, presentationally, Sifu leans into the ambiguous for most of its story, heavily relying on symbolism and mysterious surrealism. On the surface, the plot and motivation are straightforward, and yet if you pay attention, you might question if all is necessarily as it seems. How much is to be taken as literal, and how much is to be taken as symbolism? Are these events meant to communicate something more, or are they meant to show a state of disease? These questions require the player to pay attention to subtle choices of words and action, and to reflect on the small decisions they make throughout each level, potentially going unnoticed up until the very end, yet without being hidden. The story only truly gives little crumbs to a larger trail at the end, offering a new context. The answers given by the game are intentionally unsatisfactory, and it openly invites more questions from the player while not so subtly guiding them to their intended destination, the truth of which requires a higher level of game knowledge, mastery, and completion to achieve. The true ending is a lesson and a reward unto itself. Sifu manages to incorporate a piece of its core message into this quest for answers. By truly mastering the game and choosing to walk a different path, you are rewarded both as the player and as the character. The suspicious player will be rewarded in knowing that it is true, not all is as it seems, and every story has two sides, but two wrongs do not make a right, nor do three, and that seeking revenge will only leave you with nothing to show for it. The mechanic of aging upon death, leaving you with less of your life to live after everything is said and done, manages to present the same message as The Last of Us, with more tact, subtlety, and consideration, allowing the player to truly contemplate the message and not the messenger. The true message being one of martial morality and forgiveness, that true strength is not to seek revenge but to stop it. To break your opponent but show him mercy, and he will no longer wish to fight you. A more culturally relevant touchstone might be, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." Or rather, "Blessed are those who have their strength under control." He who knows how to use the sword, but chooses not to. A message of discipline and self-mastery, forgiveness and letting go, forgoing vengeance and instead offering mercy. While recontextualizing the entire game in and of itself, after beating the game and seeing the true ending, it made me not want to use lethal weapons anymore. And while you cannot go through the game without combat, you are never required to be the aggressor. All conflict can be seen from two perspectives, one as retaliation for your aggression, or as self-defense on your part, and the player is given small but direct ways of contextualizing these violent encounters. The player's choice of playstyle even feeding into the narrative in their use of weaponry, which too feeds back mechanically into score. Using weapons and takedowns, while easier to do, provides less score, mechanically and narratively providing a reason not to kill anyone that you encounter. Alongside this, the game has a general lack of blood and gore, quite unlike its predecessor, The Mark of Kree, which was notably very graphic. While blood is present, it is used very sparingly and to good effect, usually only with the most violent takedowns or while using bladed weapons. Its general lack of appearance makes it even more powerful when the streak of red stands out against a stark white wall. Less is more. Much like the media of old and the message of the game itself, restraint is the best course of action for making something even more powerful. I have spoken almost entirely of the game's positives, of which, as you can tell, I feel are many. As with all things though, Sifu is not without its flaws. However, comparatively they are few. Notably, the difficulty in the game is oddly distributed, with the game's difficulty peaking towards the middle and easing off slightly from that peak at the end. The third level of 5 being the longest and most difficult, culminating in one of the most difficult bosses in the game. The benefit of this being that the third level is easily the best. The problem being that the last two levels are noticeably easier, probably due to both an easier intended difficulty and also an accumulation of player skill leading to better mastery of the systems. The final boss in the game is certainly the most challenging of them all, however I don't think he is the most difficult, if that makes sense. He demands near perfect play, and heavily punishes you for not doing so, but I find that he was not nearly as troublesome as the third. The third boss's first phase is primarily composed of mix-ups, which I, despite understanding how to avoid, cannot consistently avoid. This is also known as a skill issue. Contributing to the game's uneven difficulty, there are certain enemies that are considerably more difficult than others. All games should have an aspect of this, however, certain fights in Sifu are far more challenging than others, most of these being optional encounters, thankfully. And this might be more of the previously mentioned skill issue, but the enemies that use the charged palm strike give me lots of trouble. They stick out in my mind as being the most difficult enemies in the game, but as with all things, this problem could be resolved with more practice. They're just worth mentioning as being far and above the most difficult enemies in the game. Another issue intrinsic to most games that use a soft targeting system is that Sifu will sometimes read inputs incorrectly, and attacks will occasionally target the incorrect person, or you'll slide across the room to hit someone else instead of the person right in front of you. And while this does happen, it's fairly inoffensive, but it's sometimes annoying. Unfortunately, Sifu does seem to drop inputs in certain instances. I can't say for certain if that's what happens, but there are times it feels that way. Thankfully, it isn't a common occurrence. And it should be noted that in some of the tighter areas, the camera can be an issue, and while this personally doesn't bother me all that much, it can be irritating from time to time. You will definitely encounter times where the camera will melt into the wall, and you'll be blind for a moment. In the overall quality of the game, these issues are very minor, and while they may be more important to some than others, they should be mentioned. I don't think that any of these are big problems and are easily overlooked. Sifu is a fantastic game that deserves attention. It's well worth your time and energy. It's both fun, thoughtful, tense, and enjoyable. It feels like what video games should be. Focused, lean, well-designed, and considered. The game offers plenty of replayability both for high score and simply for enjoyment, offering a very impressive amount of post-game content in its arenas, some of which are even more difficult than the main game. It also offers hidden developer challenges and a variety of achievements as well, if that's your sort of thing. As of writing this, the developers just announced the game's final content update coming out on September 7th, which will include 6 new arenas, 75 more challenges, and some new costumes. This game is well worth it.
為完咗添。